So I'm going to be going over the second TED Talk video, and so I'm going to give a brief synopsis of what it covered. So pretty much it covered about how the brain development in the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system in adolescence, and pretty much why do adolescents, teenagers, or early 20s people behave the way that they do, and the stigmatism around it. And I'm also going to discuss how the different parts of the brain interact with decision making in adolescents compared to adults, and why the decision making is so drastically different from the two age ranges, and how puberty and other aspects of teenagers' lives and the environment around them are playing an important role in how they communicate and see the world, and the decision making that is going on within their brain development. So, the areas of the brain that the speaker pointed out are the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system. And the prefrontal cortex is the front of the brain, like the front half of the brain. And the limbic system, she kind of discussed, it's kind of like in the middle of the brain, towards like the bottom. And the main functions of them are the prefrontal cortex pretty much is involved with decision making, social interaction, social cues, and self-awareness. And the limbic system processes emotions and processes reward processing. And the areas of the brain change throughout adolescence and adulthood. So the prefrontal cortex is shown to change a lot within adolescence, discovered by MRIs, which are pretty much like brain scans to discover certain functions of the brain. And it is also found to not fully develop until they are about out of adolescence, so late 20s, early 30s. And the activity in the prefrontal cortex is less frequent in adolescence, so it doesn't really occur as often than in adults because they make different social decisions. The social priority decisions in adolescents' minds are drastically different than those of adulthood past, their early to mid 30s. So that is why it is so drastically different by the way that the two act. And the prefrontal cortex develops later in boys than in girls because puberty plays such a big role in the development of the prefrontal cortex, which is decision making and different things like that. And that is pretty much why it's different in boys than in girls, because of puberty. And the gray matter in the prefrontal cortex declines during puberty. A lot of it is broken off and deteriorated, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, it's actually a good thing, because the gray matter in the prefrontal cortex is pretty much like cell connections, and they decline during adolescence and during puberty because due to the environment around them, they are deciding what is important, what decision making essentials are important that they are going to need and which ones are not. So of an 18-year-old versus a 10-year-old doesn't really know the difference between what's important and what's right. So the gray matter that is deteriorating and that is lessening and getting weaker is that is not as important, and then the gray matter that is staying, the cell connections that are still staying, are the ones that are actually strengthening, and so that the important cell connections can build a stronger bond in the prefrontal cortex to eventually make the right decisions, which, develops after adolescence and puberty. And the limbic system, as I said before, processes emotions and rewards, so that is why you see a lot of adolescents taking risks more than mid-30s and beyond, because their decision making is a lot different. And the limbic system is pretty much very hypersensitive and in the rewarding feeling of risk taking. So risk taking, like the reward feeling of taking risks, is much higher than when it is when they are out of adolescence. And within the TED Talk, the speaker discusses an experiment pretty much where there was like all these different cubicles, and there were a bunch of different objects, and there was two people on each side, and the person on one side, some of the objects were blocked off so they can't see the objects in there, and the person on the other side can see all of the objects. And pretty much it was conducted, the experiment was conducted so that the director that cannot see all of them tells the person that what they want to be moved. And so this pretty much is achieving perspective. It's trying to achieve which perspective the person that can see all of the objects is taking versus what how they develop the decision making by which perspective the director has. And it was conducted on adolescents and adults, and it pretty much has the ultimate goal of trying to consider their perspective, the director's perspective that cannot see the other objects, instead of their personal perspective. So, like for example, the TED Talk speaker said that if the director were to say move the top truck, and then if the person sees two top trucks but one of them the person cannot see, then they would move the one that they only see and not the one that the other person see, not taking the other person's perspective into mind. So that is pretty much the result of the experiment. The results pretty much showed that even in mid to late adolescence, mid 20s to late 20s, the ability to take into account others people's perspective is still actively developing within the prefrontal cortex. So that's pretty much the outcome of the experiment. And some of the takeaways from the TED Talk were trying to understand the behavior of adolescents and early teenagers by taking into account the changes in their brain and their body, especially taking into account puberty. Puberty has a lot more changes rather than just physical changes to women and men, but it also has a lot of psychological changes, and the way that they think is often being dictated by the things that are going on inside of them. And it also suggests that people need to take into account the environment that the adolescent's in is really shaping them. So if they're in an environment and they surround themselves with people who take more risks and don't make as logical of decisions, then it is proven that they will probably follow with that just because of the development that's going on inside of the brain. Excuse me. And the things that the textbook suggests that supported the findings of the TED Talk, along with the experiment and the different things that she pointed out, were that sometimes the brain structures and connections that govern the high level of reasoning we associate with adult decision making is not possible prior to early adulthood, like teenagers or early 20s. It is just like they cannot see what the adults are seeing. They do not see it from the same perspective. It is not possible for them to think that way because they don't have a fully developed prefrontal cortex like the adults do. So pretty much the overall synopsis was that what sometimes is seen as the problem with teenagers and early 20s people, risk-taking, poor decision-making, self-consciousness, shouldn't be stigmatized, but rather should be an opportunity for learning opportunities and educational opportunities and social development to try and teach the young adolescent the right way of decision-making and the right way to go on within taking in other people's perspectives.